So when it's referring to heavens, is it referring to celestial, our celestial?
Yes, that is exactly right. When Peter is talking about that Jesus is going to come again like a thief in the night, verse 10, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. That is the created, visible, that is our universe. The entire universe is going to be shut down by God, and because the entire universe is infected with sin. So yes, that is exactly what that is talking about. And that's why he says, but we're looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Okay, so I'm making the case here that I believe that the eternal, that our final heaven is going to be a redeemed creation. And we are going to spend eternity on a new earth that is perfect, and God is going to dwell among us. And it's going to be very much, in some ways, it's going to be very similar to God's original plan and original work at creation. So the first piece of evidence here is that Peter says we are looking for a new earth. And I don't find any reason in this context, I don't find any reason to take earth in any other sense than its literal meaning there, because every time Peter uses it in this whole discussion, he's speaking about the earth, the earth. Okay, now the next question is there another reason that I think we should take this literally, that we are literally looking for a new earth in which righteousness dwells, is because other passages seem to clearly support that notion. Romans chapter 8 is where you want to go. Look at Romans chapter 8. Let's take a look. Romans chapter 8. Exhibit B. I see that on the law shows. Exhibit A, Exhibit B. Exhibit B is Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 has a couple of the most noted and quoted passages in the New Testament. For instance, verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. That is one of the more familiar passages in Romans chapter 8. It has been sustaining and empowering Christians for over 20 centuries, and it is going to continue to empower Christians until Jesus comes back. I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. We all suffer. Sometimes it's through our own sinful choices. Sometimes it's because of our allegiance to Jesus, and sometimes it's just because we live in a fallen world. But we all suffer. Make no mistake about it. And sometimes it can be soul crushing, that suffering. And it's in moments like that the Spirit comes along here in verse 18 and tells us, listen, I promise you that the suffering is nothing that's going to be compared to what you've got coming. And then there's verses 24 and 25. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance, we wait eagerly for it. And so again, what he's doing here is he's reminding us that our salvation that we have now, it is just partial. There is a major aspect of our salvation that is still out in the future. And this gives us encouragement in the midst of all of our sufferings and all of our trials, all of our struggles against sin, all of our agonies, that God, we have this great part of our retirement benefits waiting for us as Christians. And so these are very popular. These verses have again been sustaining Christians for forever. Verse 18, verses 24, and verse 25. Now, sandwiched between verse 18 and verses 24 and 25, there are some less familiar verses, but equally exciting. And what's so exciting about these verses is they reveal the whole scope of God's plan of redemption. And I think it reveals the whole scope of God's plan of salvation with more clarity than any other passage in the New Testament, maybe. And when we often think of the plan of salvation, usually what we think of is that it only applies to sin-infected human beings, and that what God is going to redeem, what God is going to save, He's going to save you and He's going to save me. But in this block of verses, Paul reminds us that God's plan of salvation really applies to every nook and cranny of the universe. Take a look at this. First of all, we've already read, okay, verse 24 and 25. Let's read about our part of it, that we're going to be saved, that we're going to be redeemed. That's exciting. Look down at verse 23. And not only this, but we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. We've already looked at that verse this week. We are waiting eagerly, Paul says. So yeah, this is part of God. When we think of salvation, this is what we think about. We are waiting eagerly. God is going to do something for us. An important part of our salvation is in the future. We're waiting for it. We can't wait for it to happen. And what is it? It is going to be the redemption of our bodies. Like I said, we've already mentioned that. So we have that aspect that we're familiar with. God is going to redeem our bodies. And we've already talked about what that means. We're going to be set free from corruption. We're going to be, the body that we're currently walking around in we're going to get a new model of it. It's going to be perfect in every conceivable way, and we can hardly wait for that to happen. But Paul says there's something else that is eagerly waiting to be set free from corruption as well. Not just us. Take a look. Let's go back to verse 18. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious, this is verse 19, it's important. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So I love this because what Paul is doing here is he's personifying all of creation. Giving them the attributes of a person. And like we're waiting eagerly for the redemption of our bodies, the creation is waiting eagerly for that to happen. That's what means when he says, for the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. The creation, in other words, can't wait for us to receive our redeemed bodies. That's the revealing of the sons of God. And the creation can't wait for that, it says. It's waiting eagerly, just like we're waiting eagerly. Well, why is the creation waiting eagerly for our redemption when Jesus comes back? The redemption of our bodies. Well, the answer is in the next verse. Because when our bodies are redeemed, it's going to be redeemed too. Look at verse 20. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So the creation itself, it says, can't wait, is waiting eagerly, because it's in verse 21 again, it says that the creation itself also, we're not alone in being set free from corruption. The creation itself is going to be set free from corruption when we're set free from corruption. Let me just read that again in verse 21, that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. I think it's important, by the way, that that image of childbirth, that we understand that. creation is groaning and suffering the pains of childbirth. You know, why in the world did Paul use that image? And was it because he just wanted to think of something that really pictured suffering and groaning, and childbirth is one of those things? No, there's more to it than that. I agree with David Lipscomb when he says that in his commentary, in the Gospel Advocate commentary, that he says that image, has to mean something. And basically what he says that it means, and he's right, is that what you have in the whole picture of childbirth is something that where pain and suffering gives way to something glorious. And you know, my wife over here, she's I'm probably said it before, and some of you know, maybe some of you don't. She's a labor and delivery nurse, and one of the reasons she wanted to work in that field was that, generally speaking, you know, it's the happiest unit in the hospital. You know, granted, there's lots of pain and there's lots of blood, but all that pain and all that blood eventually give way to lots of joy, assuming a normal, healthy pregnancy. And so the pain of all of that childbirth is rewarded with something wonderful and extraordinary. And the pain of all of that birth is replaced with pleasure and excitement of delivering new life. And so Paul's point is that the suffering fallen universe is going to eventually give way to the delivery of a new sin-free creation. I mean, that's what Paul says there. For the anxious, again, let's just read verse 19 again and 20. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope, by the way, the New Testament idea of hope is certainty, you know, a confident expectation, not wishful thinking. In confident that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And so, like I said, I think Lipscomb's point there is that that the imagery of labor has to point to something. His actual words is they, that is labor pains, point to the coming time of delivery. And listen, let me just kind of quote Lipscomb, what Lipscomb said here way back in the 1800s in his commentary. What he ties this to, the verse that he ties Romans 8:2. He ties it to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13. He says, what Paul says here confirms what Peter said. We're looking for a new earth in which righteousness dwells. In which righteousness dwells, that is sin-free. Well, that's what Paul says is going to happen here. The creation is going to be set free. Here's what he actually said. They, that is the labor pains, point to a coming time when, and he quotes it, according to his promise, we look for new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. It's a passage that is very powerful about, as I said, about the scope of creation. Not only are we going to be set free, but the creation itself is going to be set free. Now, some people, the other view, basically when I said there's kind of two prominent views of what the nature of our eternal paradise existence is going to be. And keep in mind, both views say there's going to be eternal paradise existence. The other view is that the earth is going to be annihilated. All of the visible creation is going to be annihilated. And we're going to be taken to the invisible spiritual dimension of realm of creation. And there we are going to spend eternity. And it's going to be much like a continuation of the intermediate state, where we are in the spiritual realm of creation. And so that's the other view. So the other view is kind of our eternal state is a continuation of what we expect in the intermediate state, whatever the nature of that life is. It's paradise, no doubt. And it's basically a continuation of that. This view that we're going to then, after we receive our bodies, be brought back to a perfect earth. But those who hold to the view that that heaven is going to be in the spiritual realm of creation. As they look at this, sometimes they have a little bit of difficulty with this. I think they have a little difficulty with this passage where Paul says that the creation itself will also be set free from corruption into the freedom of the glory of children of the glory of God, freedom of the glory of the children of God. And, I don't think the imagery of annihilation fits this at all. I don't think that you can, that it's saying the creation is suffering and groaning and can't wait to be annihilated. That's not the freedom of the children, glory of the children of God. The freedom of the glory of the children of God is redemption. I think this is one of the most powerful passages that speak of the fact that that our eternal state, our eternal heaven, is going to be a renewed, redeemed creation.
What they could be the other article,
Mm-hmm.
the one you're
Mm-hmm.
saying about the one where they think that everything's been taken up into to heaven, right? I mean, what might be implicit in this is that perhaps he's saying, right, well, all creation knows it's in its sense, itself in some sense, it knows its material and destruction. Whereas if the spiritual essence of creation is then lifted up into the spiritual realm.
No. There is no spiritual essence of creation. There is no spiritual essence of creation. Creation is material. It is inanimate. And God makes that clear from the very beginning. It's not to be worshipped. It is at the sovereignty of God. It has absolutely not. There is no spiritual force within the material.
Well, there is soul in the creatures.
No. There is no eternal soul in the creature, in animals.
Well, if you have a look at what it says in the LXX, it actually says so.
Well, I will have to look at that a little bit later, but no, I don't believe at all. There is nothing. I don't think, Jim, there is anything. Man is fundamentally different than animals. We are created in the image of God. Jesus Christ took on the form of a man in order to save human beings. Everything else is corrupted with sin. Everything else will be destroyed. But mankind will be, mankind is the only one that has soul, spirit.
Well, spirit, I take spirit as being distinct. So, in the sense that spirit is what God breathed into us.
They're used really interchangeably in Scripture, spirit and soul are. And so you'll see that used very, very differently. If you want to talk about that a little bit more, we'll do that at lunch. Graham? Okay. Look at Matthew 5. Let's look at Exhibit C now. So Exhibit A, for the idea that our eternal state of heaven is going to be a redeemed creation, is Peter says, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Paul then says in Romans chapter 8 that the creation itself is going to be set free from its corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And now let's look at Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, if we accept the straightforward meaning of Peter's words, we're looking for a new earth in which righteousness dwells. If we accept it in a straightforward, literal way, and I don't think there's anything in that context to suggest that it should be understood metaphorically. If we then couple it with what Paul says and accept the straightforward statement of Paul in Romans chapter 8, then I think that we're able to easily understand what Jesus means in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, where he makes a statement here that puzzled me for a long time. In fact, it has puzzled a lot of people for a long time. It is in verse 5, and it says this: "Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth." Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit. Those last 6 words, "for they shall inherit the earth," have prompted a lot of head scratching down through the ages. And a fairly typical response is, what in the world does Jesus mean when he says they will inherit the earth? And I recently pulled out an old sermon binder I did in Matthew years and years and years ago, and to see what I did with this text when I preached through the sermon on that years and years ago. And here's what I wrote in that 2 decade. Oh, this was 20 years ago. I wrote these words. I wrote them. Now look what Jesus says about the one who is gentle, the one whose strength is controlled, the one who is patient, long-suffering, and who doesn't seek personal vengeance. He says, they shall inherit the earth. What exactly does that mean? Several suggestions have been made, and it's difficult to say what it means with absolute certainty. When I preached it 2 decades ago, I said, a lot of suggestions have been made, but it's hard to say what it means with certainty. Well, I don't think it's hard to say what it means with certainty anymore. You know, back then, though, I didn't just leave the church with that. You know, I didn't want to, you know, say, I don't know, and just move on. I wanted to give them something to think about. But you know, 20 years ago, like I said, it was a puzzle I couldn't solve. And I read and I studied and I saw the options that people were presenting, the explanations that were made. But at the end of the day, it was a riddle I really couldn't answer, and I truly didn't know for sure what he meant. The only thing that I did know is all of the proposed solutions that I was encountering from about 5 or 6 commentaries just were not very convincing. And so, like I said, I wanted to offer the church more than I have no clue, so let's move on. So I shared 2 proposed explanations. And what I did was I said, these are for me, the least objectionable of the explanations for this passage. They shall inherit the earth. And I said, but I don't like either one of them, really. I don't find either one of them satisfactory. But if someone held a gun to my head and said, you have to choose one, then of these 2 least objectionable, I would reluctantly choose one of the 2 least objectionable. And so, you know, what are those things, those explanations that I considered back 20 years ago to be least objectionable? Well, one was that some suggested that when Jesus said that the meek, the gentle shall inherit the earth, he basically said that he was basically meaning, this is one explanation you'll find, he basically meant that we would experience a deeper and fuller and more meaningful and enjoyable life on this earth because we know God. And so that's a very common explanation. We will have a more fulfilling life. We will have a more satisfying life. We will have a more enjoyable present life than non-believers. Well, there were some reasons that I couldn't really enthusiastically buy that explanation 20 plus years ago. And for those reasons, I still can't really buy that explanation. For one thing, if that's what Jesus meant when he said, they shall inherit the earth, then he couldn't have chosen a more awkward way to say it. If he was meaning we're going to have a more fulfilling, a more satisfying life on this present earth than non-believers, man, that is an awkward way to say it. They shall inherit the earth. But more than that, I just don't think that message fits the big picture of the New Testament. In the New Testament, the picture that is presented is that God's people live with an ongoing possibility that we might have to endure a very miserable treatment here in the here and now. That is a real possibility. That authentic faith might bring a lifetime of brutal and authentic suffering. And don't forget what happened to the Hebrews. Take a look real quickly at Hebrews chapter 11. As they are thinking, but they are suffering so deeply and so much that they are really considering leaving Christ. And Christ and the Hebrew writer is trying to get them to hang on. And so one of the things in chapter 10, he says in verse 32, remember the former days when after being enlightened, that is after you became a Christian, you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were treated. You showed sympathy to the prisoners, accepted joyfully the seizure of your property. And the reason they were able to endure this is because they kept an eye to the future, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession, a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. What the Hebrew writer says is, listen, hold on, because keep in mind what God has for you in the future is going to make all of this that you have lost and all of this suffering worth it. Go over to chapter 11, you'll see kind of the same thing.
Is that frustrating?
Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 32, going down through just kind of following a few verses after that. Yes, sir. Hebrews chapter 11, as he's talking about people of great faith, and he talks about others, it says in verse 36, and others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. All these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. They didn't receive yet what God had promised, but sawn in two, living in holes, property confiscated. And remember what we read about Moses and there in Hebrews chapter 11 there, verse 25 and 26, that he chose rather, it says, to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproaches of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking for a reward. So, that's the biblical picture of what life might be like if you choose to follow Christ. You may find yourself on the receiving end of an almost never-ending stream of rejection and mistreatment. And if that happens, just to be real honest with you, life in the right now, life in the here and now, probably won't be as fulfilling, and it won't be as satisfying, and it won't be as enjoyable for those who choose to walk in step with the world. It just won't. And listen, let's not forget that even though our world in the West is becoming, increasingly anti-Christian, and we don't know what the future holds, but still compared with some places in the world today, we got it good. Because some people in parts of the world, some brethren are suffering hellish treatment because they call Jesus Lord. And I'm pretty sure that the notion that Christians are supposed to find life on this present earth to be more deeply satisfying and fulfilling than non-Christians probably doesn't play too well in an authentically persecuted community of faith. So I know that we've got the joy down in our heart. I know that, regardless of our external circumstances of life. That's true. That is absolutely true. And I love to sing that with the kids at VBS and everything, because it is true that when we realize that we're children of the King, there is a deep, deep, deep sense of joy that is always there. And it stays in our hearts. But I also know that the ever-present joy of knowing that our name's written in heaven doesn't transform the nightmare of persecution into a satisfying and fulfilling and enjoyable earthly life. What that does is help sustain us in that agony. And that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to do with the Hebrew Christians there. He's trying to sustain them in their agony, in their pain, and in their suffering by saying, the future's coming. Not the present. The future's coming. And you've got a reward in the future. And so the idea that inherit the earth means probably that if you're a Christian, you're going to have really a more satisfying, fulfilling, enjoyable here and now on this earth than non-believers. I don't buy it. That don't make any sense to me. So that was the one that I didn't like. The other option that I presented to the church back then, when I was trying to say, here's two possibilities that make most sense. One is that one. The other is this. Well, the earth is being used in a figurative way to say we'll inherit heaven. We'll inherit heaven. And that's the only other option, that it's just God's using earth because we understand earth is home, and Jesus is saying, we will inherit. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit heaven. But that was the other possibility. But I didn't like that either. And the reason I didn't like that either, quite frankly, well, there were several reasons. Number one, again, the word earth is never used all through Matthew and all through the Sermon on the Mount. Anytime you see the word earth, Jesus doesn't use it figuratively. He doesn't. It's always used, and it is in its most normal and ordinary sense. It is just not there. So you have to see how Jesus uses the word earth, and you have to see how Matthew uses the word earth, and every time he uses it, it's just earth. And so I didn't like that. Didn't make sense that suddenly earth is being used to describe heaven. Listen, Jesus described heaven a lot of different ways, but never with earth. He never said that. He would talk about life or eternal life or kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God, but he never used earth as a figurative expression of heaven. And so that didn't say. The other reason that it didn't make any sense to me was because of the word inherit. You will inherit the earth. When the New Testament uses the word inherit or inheritance, it pretty much always refers to a blessing in the future, not a blessing here and now. For instance, there are only two other places in Matthew's gospel where Jesus specifically identifies what his followers will inherit. Only two other places. And in both of those places, Jesus is clearly telling about a future life reward, not a present life reward. One is Matthew 19:29, where Jesus says, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. And the other one is in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 34. And this is in the context of the judgment day that we've been reading. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So those are the only two other places in Matthew that Jesus uses the word inherit. And he's always using it in reference to eternal life, a future life reward, not a present life reward. And so when you understand all of that the word earth is never used as a to figuratively just describe, some ethereal heaven. And that inherit is not used to describe a present blessing. Again, I just didn't. I didn't find it satisfying that someone say, "Well, this obviously talks about." This is using it in a figurative way. Let me share a couple of other things with you also. That the reason I think earth here should be taken literal. There's nothing in the immediate context which suggests that we should adopt a figurative meaning of the word earth. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. That sounds like straightforward, literal language to be understood in a straightforward, literal way. There's just nothing about that that seems like we should go, I don't think we need to understand that literally. Number two, none of the other promises in the Beatitudes seems to be using figurative language. None of them. I mean, just listen. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For they shall be comforted. For they shall be satisfied. For they shall receive mercy. For they shall see God. For they shall be called sons of God. For your reward in heaven is great. He's just using straightforward language and all. See you, Chris. Bye-bye. He's just using straightforward language in all of these Beatitude promises. And if he's using straightforward language in all these other Beatitude promises, I think he's using straightforward literal language here. In this Beatitude promise, it seems to make more sense when he says they shall inherit the earth. Again, nowhere else in the New Testament does Jesus ever use the word earth figuratively to refer to the general idea of heaven or eternal life. And I mentioned the word earth is always used in its ordinary sense. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's actually 5 other times that Jesus uses the word earth, and he always used it in its ordinary sense. And if you want to check out those other 5 references, they're in Matthew 5:13, Matthew 5:18, Matthew 5:35. I'll tell you what, they're so close together and they're so linked so close together. Let me just look at it. Matthew 5:13. You are the salt of the earth. Using in its normal, in this entire world in which we live, God expects us to live conspicuously different. We are the salt of the earth. Verse 18. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Clearly, he's talking here literally about the earth. As long as the cosmos stands, God's word will stand. Verse 35. And when he says in verse 35, I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is a footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of God. So earth, again, being used there in its literal sense. Chapter 6 and verse 10, where Jesus is, that we call it the model prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then finally, verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. So every other time he uses the word earth, he uses it in its normal, ordinary, literal sense. And so I don't think there's any reason then to try to find a figurative way that Jesus is using it. Just accept it for what it is. The word inheritance for what it is, the word earth for what it is. And after I accepted the straightforward meaning of 2 Peter 3:13, that we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, and the straightforward meaning of Romans 8:21, the creation itself will be set free from its corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God, I was finally able to end my grudging endorsement of 2 views of Matthew 5:5 that I didn't find persuasive. And I go, oh, that just means what it says it means. It means God's people. I was finally able to scratch that note off in my old sermons. And I don't think it's difficult anymore to understand what it means to inherit the earth. It means exactly what it sounds like. I mean, that earth that Peter said we're looking forward to, in which righteousness dwells, that's what he's talking about. And the one that Paul said is going to be, be delivered from its slavery to corruption and the freedom of the children of God. That's the one that Jesus is talking about here. I think he's saying there's coming a time when the earth is ours, all ours. And, just as it was God's, the sin-free home for God's people in the very beginning, eventually God's going to return his people to their sin-free home and live among us. He's going to give it back to us, take it away from the world and give it back to us as an eternal inheritance. One day, in other words, I really believe it means that we are going to inherit the earth. Questions, comments on any of those before we look at exhibit ABC? D. Graham.
Just go back to this
Yes.
point in Matthew 5:5, and the context of the Beatitudes.
Mm-hmm.
It's talking about the kingdom of heaven. I understand to be the church.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is.
Talks about something
Mhm.
that can happen,
Mhm.
but not in a redeemed. You're not going to get persecuted.
Yeah, that's right.
You're not going to get.
Yeah.
So it seems like the Beatitudes are all talking about this is my Bill of Rights,
Mhm.
if you will. This is how you're going to behave in my kingdom
Yep.
when it's inaugurated.
Mhm.
The idea of inheriting the earth, therefore,
Uh-huh.
is a future event because it doesn't happen until the end of Matthew,
Yeah.
the beginning of Acts.
Mhm.
So follow those events.
Yeah.
So the idea of the earth could also be connected to how you're going to live until the redemption finally in its fullness comes.
Mhm.
To add to that, just to complete what where my thinking is,
Mhm.
in Psalm 37, there are actually I wrote down 1, 2, 5 references to the exact same expression.
That's right.
Shall inherit the earth. In the context,
Actually, it's land there, isn't it?
I'm coming back to that.
Yeah.
They shall inherit the earth, and
Mhm.
sometimes it's translated as land.
The land.
Yeah.
The land.
Yeah. And the context there seems to be about Israel.
Yes.
The territory of Canaan that has been taken and populated. And the idea is those who are righteous, they deserve to be there. Those who are unrighteous, they don't deserve to be there. It's a land that is supposed to be filled with righteousness. Without reading the whole psalm in the few moments that I had to go through it, but I picked up those references and I kind of remember that. So it occurs to me that when the Israelites hear this, because he's talking to a Jewish audience, blessed are the they shall inherit the earth. It seems to me that if they know their scriptures well, they might start going back. I've heard that before. Psalm 37, read through it. And there the term is territory, not the whole earth.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's right.
But the Septuagint, when it translates the Hebrew word, uses the exact same word that Jesus is using in Matthew 5:5. So although the sense of Matthew 5:5 is often taken to mean the physical realm of this planet, if you will, with the Israelite thinking those terms, would you not hear that and think of territory in his context?
Oh, yes.
And think that the kingdom of heaven, the spiritual realm in which we currently inhabit in anticipation of redemption. Keeping up with me?
I am.
Redemption
it's a perfect segue to what we're dealing with next.
We are the way of great. But I guess what it comes down to is I'm wondering if that really is just tied to, it can still extrapolate into this future glory. But it also has it right here in the sense of the promise, but also in the sense of you're the ones who rightfully belong on this earth. I don't think it takes away from your argument, but I think that's the immediate understanding of what he's saying.
Well, I agree with you that God's people rightly belong on this earth. I believe that. Yeah. And because God created the earth for his people. I want to get to the land, and I'm glad you brought up Psalm 37, because that's going to we're going to get that in the next exhibit. So I'm glad you brought that up. But first of all, I agree that the Sermon on the Mount is all about life in the kingdom. What is life in the kingdom supposed to look like? It is a manifesto of that. And if we're gonna accept God's invitation to be his subject and enter the kingdom, then these are the demands of that. I totally agree with that. But I don't think, first of all, that the kingdom of heaven is always, you can't just interchange those concepts with just church, just earthly church, unredeemed. The unconsummated kingdom. I don't think in the New Testament, if you try to do that, I don't think it's going to work. That it's always the church. And so, a lot of times it is a reference to the consummated kingdom. There's coming a time when the church is going to receive we're going to be glorified and we're going to receive our eternal state. The kingdom is going to be consummated, and the will of God is going to be done over the entire earth. Some people I know have read that the prayer there in Matthew 6. your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Oh, we don't pray that anymore. I've heard people say, churches come, don't pray that anymore. That's not, I don't think that's talking about that. I think it's talking about your will be done, your kingdom come to the entire earth. May your rule cover the earth. And God's rule is, for now, the church did start, and the church is a present reality. But the rule of God covering the earth, you just walk out of these walls today, and you will see that it is not. It is not. It's present throughout the world, and but I don't think that's how this is to be understood. That there's a presence of God's people somewhere throughout the world. I'll finish my thought, and then we'll have a break for lunch. But again, I go back to. Grim, I love putting things together, and I think we have to, and we're going to really see that when we come together after lunch, putting some real things together, like the inherit the earth and inherit the land, and make some real connections. But I think the most straightforward meaning of, I still believe that the most straightforward meaning of this that makes sense in the fuller context of teaching, when he says that we shall inherit the earth, with the way that Jesus uses inheritance, it always speaks to a future end of time. It always does. And every time that he uses earth, he uses it in the sense to speak of a literal earth. And I think those are pretty powerful points that lead me to the conclusion that it fits in perfectly with, again, some of the other things that we're looking at, and some of the other things we're going to continue to look at. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to touch on those. And so I want you to come back in the next one, me and you, as I share some things, kind of bring up again some of those things that you said, and let's compare them. Okay, let's break for lunch. It is 12:06. Why don't we shoot to come back? Can we eat lunch in 40 minutes? Can we do that? Can everybody eat fast